and welcome to today's video. Today we'll be talking about languages in a globalized world, what it means to live in a globalized world, and what it means for languages and culture, because those things are actually intrinsically interconnected. Today we want to talk about essentially three things. We're going to talk about globalization as a movement. We'll be talking about the different points of view of what globalization is. We're going to have a look at the impact of languages. And thirdly, I want to talk about different reasons why you maybe now is a good time or even better time than ever before to learn a second or a third language. Let's dive into it. The first thing we want to talk about is, what is globalization? Well, there are plenty of definitions out there on the web. Here's the popular one. It reads, globalization means the speed up of movements and exchanges of human beings, goods and services, capital, technologies, or cultural practices all over the planet. One of the effects of globalization is that it promotes and increases interactions between different regions and populations around the globe. A typical definition there, and on the face of it, it doesn't look very controversial. It looks like globalization is an awesome thing. And in part, it is an awesome thing. But before we go into details, I just want to highlight that, and of course you know that today, there's essentially two very, very different views on globalization. So on the one hand, we have maybe about half of people you're going to meet in life. They see globalization as a benevolent transnational movement. In the process of breaking down barriers, making life better for everyone, exchanging culture, fast access to resources, fast problem solving, etc. Yeah, that's a big group, and they believe that globalization is an awesome thing in terms of culture and also language. On the other hand, we have another very large group, and they're essentially divided into two groups, I should say. This group, they kind of see globalization as a superimposition of either corporate ideas or ideals or socialist ideals. They see corporations muscling in, outsourcing jobs, and they see it as a threat to local culture, or they see it as a vehicle for spreading socialism, hindering growth, etc. So, two very conflicting views on globalization. It's important to take note of that as we discuss the importance of languages in a globalized world. So first of all, let's talk a little bit about what does it mean to know a language. So a lot has been said about that over the centuries, but essentially the consensus is that language and culture are interconnected. And it makes sense because everything ever said and ever done in a specific language is recorded, right? So everything said, everything done, every single book written, article, every single thing ever uttered in that language is part of that language heritage and culture. So you can't really separate the two. So knowing a second or third language, of course, has some implications for you as the speaker of that language, which makes it super interesting to speak a third and a second language. We can see that globalization, we see languages spread easily. We have access to many different languages, but we also see the replication of certain power structures as well. And what we also see is that the domination of certain languages and cultures, they lead to the extinction of other languages and cultures. So the argument here is that languages contribute to the formation of culture through vocabulary, greetings, humor, etc. And that language is the substance of culture. So languages, they serve as important symbols of group identification and the feeling of togetherness, that sense of where I belong. So you can definitely argue that without a language, people would lose their cultural identity. We get, on one hand, the ability through one or more languages to perceive new horizons and to understand new things. And that's a beautiful thing. We increase the understanding of ourselves and our place in the world and our neighbors. So languages have been and continue to be the very lifeline of globalization. we could argue that without language, there would be no globalization in the first place, and vice versa. Without globalization, there would be no world languages. So they are interconnected. Let's briefly touch upon the dark side of a globalized world and languages in a globalized world. So in rough numbers, there are around 6,500 different natural languages in the world today, but only 11 of them account for the speech of more than half the world's population. Now let that sink in for a while. That's a lot of different languages. Most of them are quite small, obviously, but only 11 of the languages account for the speech of more than half the world's population. So those 11 languages are Mandarin Chinese, Spanish, Hindi, French, Bengali, Portuguese, Russian, German, Japanese, Arabic, and English. So those are the 11 big ones. An estimation based on research is that somewhere between 4,000 and 9,000 languages have become extinct since the 15th century. And research shows that only 10% of the present languages will continue into the 22nd century. So what we're seeing here is the effects of gravity. As certain languages become very powerful and the cultures behind them, and vice versa, you're seeing people gravitate towards those languages, speak those languages to get better access to opportunities, jobs, etc. And that means that other languages and cultures, ideas, concepts, etc. built into those cultures eventually will become extinct. We have an interconnected world. We have multilingual persons that hold these linguistic groups together. And this pattern and these connections, they will also correspond to aspects of world order. So as certain languages are more powerful than other languages, they take control culturally and linguistically. And of course, talking about this, we have to talk about the language English, which is different from any other language in that it has a significant number of non-native speakers. Now, how many, you ask? I'm glad you asked. There's no specific answer to the question, but we know that around 4% of the world's population, 4, are native speakers of English. But we also know that around 25% of the world's population speak English as a second language. And that's an incredible statistic. So just about 2 billion people speak English as a second language. So all these things, of course, they lead to what we can best describe as the language squeeze. We have languages that are on the brink of extinction. And simply because a lot of those small languages have fewer than 5,000 speakers, it is hard to see how these languages and cultures will survive. It is hard for someone who's interested in languages not to feel this as a very, very sad development. It may be inevitable, and that's the way things are. Things happen in life. You know, we have spring, summer, autumn, and eventually everything dies out. But it still is a sentimental thing to see happening, because as we know by now, we're not just losing a language, we're losing part of the global culture. So I think a relevant question by now is, okay, so English is spoken by almost 2 billion non-native speakers. Does that make English an unstoppable force? Well, so far it has been, in the sense that English has been important in areas such as computing and diplomacy, medicine, shipping, especially entertainment, the computer industry, you name it. Which means that it is a very, very strong center of gravity. And so you have, again, those two groups with contrasting views. One see English as a positive thing, so symbolizes employment, education, modernity, technology. And for the other half, they see it as something like it is English that is going to eliminate identity, wipe out interests and cultures. We're going to see values being equalized, and they definitely see it as a bad thing in the world, this expansion of English. So we have those two different arguments. So here's an interesting thing I wanted to add. I call it the shifting center of gravity, because if you extrapolate that out, you may think, okay, English, the English culture, American culture, let's call it that, as United States is still the most powerful country in the world. So will American values or the American value system, will that dominate the world completely? And you can make a good argument that it will not. And this is sometimes referred to as the revenge effect. And what is meant by that? Well, as more and more non-native speakers start speaking English, what's going to happen? They make it their language. And that also means that they don't necessarily over time assume all the, in this case, American values or North American values. They make it their own. They change the language and intrinsically changes culture as well. So it's entirely possible that we're going to see a shifting center of gravity where the conqueror, to use sort of a bit of a silly word maybe in this context, but the conqueror becomes the conquered. That's entirely possible. So as it's put here, I think the ultimate challenge going forward when we talk about languages in a globalized world, the ultimate challenge is this. The great difficulty is thus considering the unity of the many and the multiplicity of the unity. Those who see the diversity of cultures tend to overlook the unity of mankind. And those who see the unity of mankind, they tend to dismiss the diversity of cultures. Very well put here. And essentially that is the dichotomy that we're going to have to try to reconcile, those two things happening. How do language or languages actually change in a globalized world? Well, they're changing in a number of different ways, and we're going to spend a couple of minutes talking about that now. I'll be talking about English because this is my area of expertise, and there are a couple of really interesting things happening. I'm going to highlight three. So there is a generalization of English taking place as a result of many non-native speakers speaking English. Have a look at some examples. Here's a simple sentence. We need to reveal some important information to the press, right? This would be a native speaker talking here. Here's a native speaker talking. We currently have 3 pieces of information to divulge. Okay, so let's focus in on the word information here, and let's have a look at how many non-native speakers are communicating the same here. Here's a non-native, and he or she says, we need to reveal some important information to the press. Here's another example. We currently have 3 informations to divulge. Okay, so here is an interesting impact. Now, information, grammatically speaking, is uncountable. And we generally solve that by using piece of information. But now we're starting to see native speakers, in fact, say informations. So what has happened here is that the sheer number of non-native speaking English, they have kind of taking over this aspect, and they're starting to dictate that it's becoming acceptable to say informations in modern English. And that is very, very interesting. It's not quite there yet, but it's close to becoming accepted. And if you are a speaker of Portuguese or Spanish or French or Italian, where you can count information, then, well, you can see the impact of certainly those cultures and those languages in English. Let's have a look at one more example. Here's another native speaker, and here she said, learning is important for many reasons. Right? Simple English sentence, grammatically correct. And here's another one. There are several lessons in life to be learned. Interesting observation here. You can see that lessons are being used in the second. We want to count the experience of learning. In this particular case, the native speaker changed the word learning for lessons when it needed to be counted. So how do non-native speakers go about doing this? Well, this is what you can hear today. A lot of non-native speakers of English saying there are several learnings in life to be learned. Or this one. In the course structure, you will find 3 learnings in module 1. Okay. So it's very interesting to see here that non-natives are beginning to count traditionally uncountable nouns. And this is a trend which I think will continue. One example of what's happening to English in a globalized world. Another thing that happens a lot is word-for-word translation, which seems to be accelerating. If you look at linguistic trends, it seems to be accelerating. So Here is what a native speaker would say. How do I say something? What's the correct word for? This would be a natural utterance by a native speaker. A lot of non-natives simply say, how do you call it? And if you think Portuguese, Spanish, French, or Italian again, you can see this is pretty much how you would express that in those 4 languages. So, word for word translation. Now, what's happening, and that's super interesting, how do you call it is not how a native speaker would say it. However, a native speaker would understand what the non-native speaker meant. Another important observation there, if an utterance by a non-native is understood by a native speaker, there's a chance it becomes incorporated into language. Now, if there is no bridge, if it is not understood, then the non-native, they have to transform it into something else. But here you can see that because the native speaker understood it, it lingers on in language and eventually could be accepted, as this is becoming accepted as well. Finally, let's talk about simplification of grammar. Here is an interesting example. Report to be sent by noon, verification needed. This is pretty much accepted English today, but grammatically, if you were to look at it, where's the article? So we actually have both an article missing and a verb missing. Same case for verification needed. The verification is needed, or a verification is needed, or was needed. So examples of how non-native use here simplifies things. Here's another one. You like pasta? Is quite common native speakers today say. And here the normal question would be, do you like pasta? Or did you like pasta when you were a kid, or something like that. So the do, auxiliary do for questions, has predicted to disappear within the next 20, 30 years, which is entirely possible. This one here, you hungry? Where's the verb to be here? You would normally say, are you hungry? Is she nice? So here we actually have an affirmative, but we raise the intonation like we would do in Portuguese, for example. She's nice. So again, we're seeing simplification of grammar, and we're seeing an assimilation of grammar taking place all over the world. The limits of my language mean the limits of my world. I think there's a lot of truth to that. Once you learn a second or a third language, the accumulated understanding of the world that you have, that you possess, is going to increase. It's super interesting. So here are some of my arguments for why now is a great moment to learn a second or third language. So now there are typical views of why you should learn a language. They generally fall into 2 categories. So one is, I need language, I need English, for example, to pursue professional goals. That's what I call a narrow objective, and it's super valid, it's super important to have English for job opportunities today. Another group are people who say, you know, when I'm traveling, I'm out and about, I'd love to be able to talk to people there, either in their native language or in English, etc. So when I travel, I need to have a second or a third language. Here are a couple of arguments why I think learning a second or a third language is super important. I simply think life is more interesting and more beautiful if you understand more than one language, literally to help in the process of breaking down barriers. And I think that's a great argument for learning another language. More than ever before, we've seen the need for finding solutions faster. We do that best if we're able to meet people in another language or in their language. So learning a second or a third language can help us understand other people better, and it'll also enable us to find solutions faster to the many problems and challenges that we face. We also, the better able we are to work together, the more accelerated growth that we get, the more growth we get, the better able we are to innovate and solve problems as well. So that's kind of linked to my previous argument. Given the choice between being a passenger in our own lives or actually participating and taking control, I belong to the latter group. I want to participate. I want to be part of the decision-making process. And your ability to communicate with other people is super, super important in that process as well. This one, potentially, is the most important argument. When you learn a second or third language, you will be better able to comprehend current affairs better. better able to try to find out which news stories are correct, which ones are not. As you well know, today the world is locked in a battle, a tribal battle, between groups that have individual truths. And this in large part can be attributed to the way the internet is monetized today through advertising. So advertisers, they want to keep your attention span for as long as possible. And they do that best by serving information that you are interested in. So politically speaking, let's suppose that you politically lean left. That means that the algorithms in Facebook, LinkedIn and Twitter and so forth, they will give you more content that leans left. The result is you will lean further left. Conversely, if you politically lean right, you're going to get more information on the right, which means that over time you will lean more right. What do we get out of that? We get the world we have today, with tribes on the left and on the right pointing fingers and saying that those guys over here are wrong and those guys say those guys over here are wrong. So, a great investment today for you as a human being is to learn a second or a third language and be able to make your own choices and not be part of those two groups pointing fingers, but trying to get qualified, verified information from the source and not depend on algorithms to tell you what is true and what is not. Of course, as the job market is fast changing through artificial intelligence, machine learning, and the new economy which is emerging now, where more and more people are working long distance, global access to job opportunities is of course super important. More and more people might be living in Brazil but working for an American company, etc., etc. So again, another super important argument. Finally, on a more philosophical, profound note, I really and truly believe that it is through the contact and interaction with other people that we ourselves grow, and vice versa. So I'm a big fan of the idea that if you truly want to unravel your full potential, you kind of need to look out and you need to speak with people from different walks of life, different countries, different cultures as much as you can. It's going to give you insights. You will learn more about yourself by doing that, and you're going to learn more about other people, and it will bring you on a path which is probably a desirable one for you and for the world as a whole. I like to say that nobody knows in life why we're here, and nobody knows what our purpose is. But if we can leave the world just a little bit better than we found it, we probably served a purpose anyway. And I think language and understanding more than one language will make that journey easier. So ultimately, language is what makes us what and who we are. And it is through speaking languages in an interconnected world that we can look ahead and try to make our journey and the journey of the people around us a positive one, so we can work together to make the world as good as it can be.